Good morning, my name is Joe Slowik. I'm going to talk about full spectrum information operations and critical infrastructure attacks because why not have a super long title? Is there feedback? Fuck, I don't need a podium anyway. So just cram as many buzzwords as I can into a title. So who am I? I do cyber threat intelligence for Dragos right now. Prior to that, I was US Navy, did IR for Los Alamos National Laboratory for a bit. But most of you probably know me because I'm a frequent shit poster on Twitter, among other things. So very active and whatnot in that regard, so you can follow me, but whatever, enough about me. We don't want to talk about me, we want to talk about critical infrastructure attacks. So first, to set the agenda, we'll go over some definitions to make sure we're all on the same page. Move on from that to reviewing some critical infrastructure attack mechanisms and methodologies, then look into expanding our scope and view of what it actually means to go after critical infrastructure and cause something disruptive. Look at some attack examples and possibilities, and then wrap that up with some defensive recommendations and what we actually do to counteract such problems. So first, what is critical infrastructure? Critical infrastructure is one of those things where if everything's critical, then nothing is, and no offense to DHS and others, but like in defining 17, 19, 25, however many critical infrastructure areas that we have right now, it's just too much. So really from the perspective of this discussion, really focusing on critical infrastructure, since we've expanded the scope of this a little bit too much. So energy, elections, government networks, etc. And then other things like transportation, like, yeah, that's cool, but how do you hack a highway? I guess if you came in Reagan last night, you see how you can hack a highway. But anyway, so trying to keep this a little bit limited. But then in terms of attack, we see like, such and such entity was attacked. Well, they got a phish. That's not an attack. That's kind of initial access. It's a little bit different. So when we talk about attacks, I'm not talking about someone got a phishing message or they got a watering hole redirect or something. I'm talking about no shit, deny, degrade, destroy, disrupt. If it's not one of those 4 Ds, it's not an attack. Things get a little murky when we start talking about preparatory actions that can lead into an attack. So I know we're in DC, so I have a lot of DoD or ex-DoD people in here. Talking about preparatory actions, like operational preparation of the environment, gets really freaking interesting really quickly. It also means that this would be a 2-hour talk instead of a 25-minute talk, so we're not going to go there today. Got some citations or whatever at the end of this paper if you want to read about this some more. So again, really, while this is important and interesting, not something we're going to talk about too much today, but really just focus on attacks. Finally, what the hell is information operations? One of those things like if I say a word like Humpty Dumpty style or whatever, it means whatever I assert it to mean. For the purpose of this discussion, and if any of you caught that Alice in Wonderland reference, like good on you. But anyway, for the purpose of this discussion, I'm just pulling this right out of US DoD JP3 TAC 13. Yes, former Navy officer, I'm sorry, you're going to have to put up with me for this today. So we're really looking at information operations as those actions that more or less insert themselves into the OODA loop or into the decision-making process of an adversary leadership or the population in some fashion. And when we talk about information operations, I learned this 10 years ago as an information warfare officer in the Navy. That's a fun title too. Really looking at 5 distinct pillars of I.O. So electronic warfare, military information support operations, otherwise known as PSYOPs. PSYOPs is a cooler name. MISO sounds a little less threatening, I guess. Moving on to military deception, operational security, and then cyber. Now, we're at a cyber conference. Yes, we are, but really tying all these together, which is the point of this talk, is kind of important in getting a full spectrum perspective on what it means to actually subvert, attack, or otherwise undermine critical infrastructure. So, what do we talk about with a critical infrastructure attack? So what we're used to seeing is like, okay, drop a bomb on something or warheads on foreheads sort of activity. But then, in addition to the more traditional kinetic sort of strike element, now we have cyber entering the picture with these entities, among others, involved. That's interesting. It provides an indirect, non-kinetic means of attacking critical infrastructure. But in doing this, are we kind of limiting ourselves or operating with one hand tied behind our back, so to speak, and going after these sort of operations? Because in looking at the full scope of how you can actually interact with critical infrastructure from an I.O. perspective, we're really leveraging only 1, maybe 2, depending on how you want to define electronic warfare, which honestly is my favorite I.O. realm, but that's going back to when I was on big gray floaty things and whatnot. We're using cyber, maybe a little bit of I.O., but then forgetting all of these other categories or methodologies that are disposable for influencing, interrupting, or otherwise causing disruption in critical infrastructure vectors. So there is this conception of influence operations, and we've already talked about this in several other talks today of looking at the Russian Internet Research Agency or whatever. It's like, oh, hacking elections or whatever by having a lot of Twitter bots and shit like that. And we have this conception of it, but we also look at it as kind of a lower tier compared to trying to blow up an oil refinery or something else along those lines. So What I'm trying to do, though, is that this is important, but maybe not on its own either, because, yeah, you can mess around with shit this way, but you're not actually going to necessarily deny, degrade, destroy, or disrupt, typically, through an influence operation alone. But all of this shows kind of a lack of creativity on the part of most adversaries and most thought leaders. I don't know what the hell you want to call them. But anyway, that if we're only looking at this as distinct ways of operating, and you can only use one of 5 methodologies and then throw influence operations in there as kind of icing on the cake, are we really looking at this in the right way? Because kinetic and cyber represent direct ways of influencing critical infrastructure or attacking critical infrastructure, but that ignores the idea of amplifying or creating uncertainty around the reliability of critical infrastructure that could allow attacks to become a bit more potent. So by combining and layering effects using multiple disciplines of information operations, we can start getting some really interesting attack vectors or attack methodologies pretty quickly. So I look at this. I worked at a nuclear weapons lab, so I know what the hell this is. Looking at like the Tellerlam model of thermonuclear weapons. Like, okay, we're talking about having some distinct effect or whatever at the core, but then boosting it through some other methodologies to create something much bigger. So in looking at this boosted fashion or whatever, can we combine that direct, discrete critical infrastructure attack with some other methodologies to create a boosted attack as a result? Well, oh, come on. So for an example of this, a really short one, everyone should remember Operation Ababil. So go DDoS a bunch of banks or whatever, the Iranians did this or whatever. It's like, it was cute. Like, okay, I can't access my bank website for a minute or whatever, big effing deal. Well, what if instead of just doing this randomly at a point in time in like November, December, I can't remember exactly when this took place, I did that in conjunction with some other event, or I did something interesting like started trending a Twitter hashtag about how the financial system's going to collapse at the same time that I'm causing a distributed denial of service against customer-facing bank portals. That gets a little bit more freaking interesting. Now you start getting panic. Now you start getting the possibility of inducing uncertainty that the banking sector is actually functioning. Do this along with the flash crash or along with the collapse of Lehman Brothers or something along those lines, and now you not only get the immediate disruption of like, hey, I've disrupted some banking operations, but also the boosted impact of creating fear, uncertainty, and doubt in a good way or the right way of using that word or combination of words around an entire critical infrastructure sector that can lead to lots of other possibilities. Start getting runs on banks. You get politicians that are screaming bloody murder or whatever about regulating the shit out of this thing now because of something very bad that happened. So by combining both that discrete action with some mechanism for then creating fear or uncertainty around that vital aspect of operations, you get something much more interesting. So the core concept here is by combining disruption, shut that off, with doubt, you create a magnified effect around how you can interact with critical infrastructure. So there's some interesting possibilities here. We could look at things like the electric sector, which I'll talk about. We can look at manufacturing, like we could kind of really depend on the F-35, probably not. Or looking at really interesting things around voting. Lots of possibilities here. We're only gonna have time to talk about a couple here. The first hasn't been said yet today, Stuxnet. Like, Jesus Christ, this Stuxnet's 10 years old or whatever. Why are we still talking about this? Well, it's because, despite that there's been a lot of publication about this, there's still a lot that people don't understand about it. So the popular conception of Stuxnet is like, oh, we're gonna use a lot of 0 days and destroy the Iranian nuclear program and crap like that. But the thing is that Stuxnet was really just one piece of an overall operation that was designed not to destroy the Iranian nuclear enrichment program, but rather designed to create uncertainty around the efficacy and increase the cost of that program to facilitate a non-military means of dismantling that program in some fashion as part of something overall called Olympic Games. And no one has tackled me yet, so maybe we don't have some spooky people in the room. Anyway, so looking at Stuxnet from an impact analysis perspective, like yes, we had a direct impact, causing centrifuges to overpressurize or overspin, resulting in them eating themselves. But it wasn't every centrifuge in the enrichment hall. Not only that, it wasn't both enrichment halls. Only Natanz was affected, not Fodor, which was being constructed at the same time. So you had some equipment failure, but it wasn't massive across everything that was being operated. But then you had this indirect impact that operators no longer trusted the process. You already had kind of a janky knockoff IR1 centrifuge design that people didn't trust to begin with that was starting to operate in an even jankier fashion for reasons that people couldn't really identify or understand. And so leadership no longer really had good trust or faith in how that operational chain was working. Then you add on layered effects on top of that through supply chain interdiction, covert actions like blowing up certain scientists in the streets of Tehran. Not cool. And then doing other things like through sanctions, et cetera, to start creating ever more pressure as a combined campaign designed to make this entire operation creating fuel for nuclear weapons more expensive, more difficult, and harder to do. And the result being that you're still enriching uranium, and in fact, it's been cited multiple times that the rate at which your enriched uranium was being produced through the progression of the Stuxnet attack time frame, as best we understand it, actually increased. So they were still doing this, but doing so at a greater cost, greater uncertainty, just making it a real big pain in the ass. So the result was that while uranium was being produced, trust in the process and the ability to do this sustainably and counting on that over time was significantly reduced over time. Man, I repeated a bunch of words there. So the results of Stuxnet, you increase the cost of the enrichment program, but combined with physical and I/O measures, increase the risk and uncertainty of that program, which likely facilitated us not bombing Iran. I remember John McCain bomb Iran or whatever, like crazy shit. But likely facilitated the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action negotiations, which we then shit on a year ago now, I guess, that altered the National Command Authority of Iran decision calculus. We stopped an enrichment program by not dropping bombs on people, or even credibly threatening to do so, which is pretty damn impressive, and did so using a combination of cyber influence, military deception, and a little bit of military information support operations, all combined together. That's pretty freaking cool. First example or whatever that we can really look at for that sort of thing taking place, and as a result of using multiple facets of information operations to create that effect. Now, what about electric infrastructure, since we've already talked about this in the context of Sandworm? So you have this general conception like, oh, I'm going to turn the lights off and facilitate the zombie apocalypse or whatever. Everyone's going to die. But there are some additional opportunities for electric attacks that get less noticed, but we've already seen some hints of people kind of experimenting in this space. So you can undermine public confidence in critical infrastructure. We're going to talk about this in depth, but like ask anyone in California what they think about their utilities right now. We can create economic friction or cause, again, increased cost to doing business because now you need to invest in a generator to make sure that you can continue operations and whatnot. So we saw this a little bit in 2015. So the S word, Sandworm. 2015 it's kind of like the junior partner in certain respects or whatever to the more technically sophisticated 2016 attack. But what's interesting about this, if we look at how this attack progressed, so penetrate the ICS environment, manually manipulate the distribution sites in order to create an outage. Okay, that's kind of like, I've heard this described in the power sector as being parlor tricks as opposed to actual attacks, just like kind of demonstrating like, look what we can do to mess you up. Because combining that then with kill disk to wipe workstations, the probably most technically interesting part of this entire attack was deploying the serial to Ethernet firmware rewrite or whatever that bricked a bunch of devices, inducing a loss of control and loss of visibility aspect. And then finally, there was this sort of like denial of service on telephone utilities, like telephone hotlines leading to the utilities. And that just seemed at first like, why would you do that? Like, what's the point of this or whatever? Is this just icing on the cake, or is this, really, why? Is this just trolling, or is this something maybe a little bit more subtle? Because if we look at how the telephone system played a part within Ukrainian electric operations in the period of 2015, that after you had an induced loss of visibility and loss of control in the operational environment, the telephone system was both the primary means for customers impacted to try and figure out what the hell was going on, and also a very important means for the operators themselves to try and identify what the hell was going on out in the field, short of sending someone in a truck to investigate each impacted site. So looking at this telephone denial of service, maybe it's less trolling, but really trying to experiment with boosting that initial direct disruptive effect with something else. So pivot back away from this for a second. California power crises. None of these are cyber related as far as I can tell unless we have like evil people in volcanic layers or whatever with weather controlling machines. But looking at things like the PG&E shutoffs, the deregulation brownouts from the early aughts, for those who remember such things or whatever, is that we see this sort of natural or pseudo-natural instability in power operations already, and the result of these is that you get things along the lines of panic, civilian or customer distrust in how these utilities are operated, increased regulation, greater economic friction, etc. So we see how these sort of things play out in reality, just not through some attacker doing so deliberately. But the result of such things, and looking at other items like the 2003 Northeast blackout, among other items, that we get responses as a result. We get lawsuits, we get loss of economic activity, we get people, so the bill referenced in the analog answer to securing the grid is actually really good, but the popular conception of what that means, like, we need to go away from digital. Digital sucks, go back to analog. Like, that's not really how this works, and if you did that, like, I hope you like your power bill going up as a result of that as well. So you start creating lots of different interesting knock-on effects that start having really significant and meaningful economic and societal impact by creating uncertainty or lack of perceived reliability in how this most critical of critical infrastructures operates. So your options for an initial attack then, like, okay, you can hack something, like the Russians have done a couple of times in Ukraine, or if you're willing to airdrop some Spetsnaz into California or something and shoot up a substation, you can create a physical direct impact at, say, a single transmission site or something along those lines to create that initial attack option. But then you can have a much more complex attack pathway from there. So first, gaining access, physical or virtual, to utility networks to do something bad, induce that outage or interruption or some other noticeable effect that people are going to pay attention to, but then follow that disruption up with some weird shit, whether that's more traditional I/O or influence operations, like starting a Twitter trending hashtag or something along those lines, or seeding news stories about lack of reliability or how CEOs are lining their pockets without actually investing in grid stability or security, and then allow victim responses to produce negative consequences as an over-response, kind of like an over-immune response to an infection that then creates the actual sort of ultimate impact. We saw a little bit of this staged activity in the 2016 Ukraine event, where the malware, In-Destroyer Crash Override, was used to facilitate that immediate disruption, and then through how that attack was staged, then try and basically assume operator actions to then deliver a physical protection attack at the very end of it. It didn't work properly because they fucked it up, but that was sort of the overall goal. So we see attackers starting to learn a little bit about how you can start layering or sequencing attacks in question, but these sorts of items get not only more interesting, but also potentially a little bit cheaper than trying to do something like blow up a transmission site. So, to quote Lenin, what is to be done? No one's fucking laughing. Yeah, anyway. So looking at how USG is approaching this, we have this idea of like, we'll defend forward, we'll take the fight to the adversary, we're sick of getting our asses kicked or whatever, like, let's go meet the adversary where they exist. Or if we want to like kind of dial this back a little bit, we can say the same thing and call it persistent engagement, but really not changing our minds about how any of that works. Well, that sounds cool in theory, but the problem is that by taking this sort of pseudo-offensive response to these sorts of actions to disrupt attacks before they exist, is that we start getting into problems of escalation management and incentivizing attackers to do bad shit earlier than they otherwise would have, because we put them in a use it or lose it capability. Kind of like looking at rail timetables or whatever in Western Europe in 1914. So it's possible, it kind of scares me, and I don't think it's actually all that effective though. I write a lot about this privately, so you can look at some of that for greater detail. I don't have enough time to really get into the details of this. So there's ideas around this, but not very effective or not terribly creative ideas. And not only that, but it doesn't really tackle the I/O component that lies behind some of this activity. So as a result, we don't really have any easy answers. So the problem is bad. I don't feel bad for raising it, but the thing is that we don't have any really good solutions that anyone's pursuing right now, because a lot of the solutions in question are both difficult to deploy and expensive to actually carry out. So the real way to try and get at this problem is a combination of effects or capabilities that serve in concert to not just satisfy the direct disruption attack portion, but also to take care of the potential knock-on effects and maintaining that sense of trust and confidence that critical infrastructure can be maintained. So operational resilience is first and foremost key. You don't have to worry about a lot of this crap if you can make sure that the power doesn't go off to begin with, or you can make sure that voting machines aren't hooked up to the friggin' internet or something like that. But then being able to perform actual timely root cause analysis to figure out why the hell something happened, so that you can reduce that sort of shadow of doubt around events, that we can say that this event was caused by these actions associated potentially with this actor. Not taking months or years to do so, but doing so as quickly as possible in response to events, so that we can identify plausibly, reliably, why something took place when resilience fails. But then, and this is where things get kind of sticky, and I'm a former humanities major, so maybe this is why it's natural for me. Looking at things like education, information, public affairs. One of the things from an I/O perspective in the military is that people look at public affairs officers as being like, they're just glorified press contacts. Who the hell cares about them? Well, that public messaging, public diplomacy aspect is a vital capability that is seldom recognized for how important it is in getting out a message, educating people on what an entity is doing. So figuring out or educating the public on how the hell the power grid works, what it actually means for how the voting system is working, and understanding how these systems function, what sort of safeguards are in place is vital to ensure that you then have a public that is reasonably informed and not just getting their information from some random Twitter hashtag or God knows whatever online news site or whatever that picks up any conspiracy theory, to make sure that we have a population that is less susceptible to bad narratives sparked by some sort of event. That crap ain't easy, but at the same time, you see some of this taking place within the actual economy right now, when you go to, say, a museum or a zoo, and like you see, this exhibit about, how your power works or whatever by certain companies. Like, people are trying, but maybe not trying hard enough and in the right ways. We need to invest more in doing that, though, to make sure that we can retain as much control over these narratives as possible, because getting 100% reliability in that operational resilience category just isn't going to happen. So I think these slides are going to be available. I don't know for sure. Anyone know? Anyway, if not, this will be on SlideShare. Here's a couple of links, because this is a fairly short talk, but these will then spider out to a bunch of other stuff if you're interested in reading about this some more. I'm writing a paper on this as well. It'll probably come out in like early spring. We'll see, because I got a lot of other shit to do. So I think we might have a time for a couple of questions. Yep. I talked really freaking fast, so.
So for a company like Dragos, where do your data sources come from, and where do you come to conclusions on things?
Right. A little off topic, but sure. Like any other security company, so combination of customer data, industry, and miscellaneous contacts, open source research, commercial data sets, etc. So no different from what a FireEye, a CrowdStrike, or anyone else or whatever would try to mine. Basically anything that we can do, and then handling it within whatever stipulations are provided.